Hey everyone. Thank you for joining me on my first podcast of Raising Cain. And while we wait for some folks to join up, I'm going to just kind of go down a breakdown of kind of where we're going to go tonight and the things that we're going to talk about. So there are some things going on in the news that I think are important that we need to discuss and talk about. Namely, there was a move by Saudi Arabia for the first time, I think in like 25 years or something like that, to basically remove ourselves from the basically the petrodollar standard. And so that's going to have an impact on our economy. And I want to talk about that a little bit tonight. There's also been a lot in the news about what's going on with China and the supply chain, and that's impact on our national security, specifically as it relates to our national critical infrastructure. And so I want to talk about that a little bit as well. And then I'm going to talk about where I am in terms of, now that my campaign is over, what am I planning on doing? So this first show, it's not going to be what my normal show is going to look like, but it's really kind of an introductory to share with you guys, kind of where my heart is and what I hope to accomplish. And hopefully we can work together, to accomplish some things in this country and hopefully save our country. Because I do think that we're headed down a very dangerous path. But I do have hope, and I do want to make that clear. So as I like to always start things, especially a new endeavor, I'm going to open in prayer, and then we'll get going. Heavenly Father, I thank you, God, for this opportunity to share my thoughts and to discuss with folks, Lord, the things that are going on in this country and around the world. Lord, I pray that you would guide and direct our discussion and the talk tonight. I pray, God, that you would bless our country, for surely we cannot survive without your blessing, Lord. We need your hand of providence, and we ask that you would bring it. Ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thanks, guys, for joining. And there's a lot of interesting things that are going on in the world right now, some scary things. But one of the things that I've noticed is that oftentimes the media will put out a headline and they won't tell you really the details behind it. They just like to put out the clickbait or the fear porn and get us all worrying and freaking out about everything that's going on. But there are some pretty significant things that have been happening, and it does feel a little bit like we're on edge. And so I want to talk about a few different things. The first thing that I want to just kind of talk about and get out of the way is, yes, I was running for Congress for the U.S. House of Representatives in West Virginia and the 2nd District. I lost my primary about 3 weeks ago. So I've been decompressing and kind of getting over that and, putting that aside, thinking about my next plan, praying about it. And one of the things that became very apparent is that I need to still have a place to have a voice. And the place to do that, I think, is through social media. So I'm going to continue to speak on topics, some topics. Most of them, I think, will be probably national security related. That is where my background is. My background primarily has been 27 years in cybersecurity. I got my start in the United States Army, and then it just kind of, my career kind of ballooned from there. But many people are also aware of my background going to the FBI and eventually becoming one of in fact, the first FBI whistleblower ever to use the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act. And I ended up blowing the whistle in 2017, 2018 on the FBI's cover-up of Hillary Clinton's crimes related to Uranium One, the Clinton Foundation. It included crimes of money laundering, public corruption, securities and exchange fraud, and terrorism financing. And I've done a lot of interviews on that subject, so I'm not going to get too much into that tonight. But there will be, some opportunities, I think, in the future to interview some other whistleblowers, and then we'll have some back and forth on those types of topics. After my whistleblowing experience, I went on to get called by the White House and asked to participate on an election integrity team. This was right after the 2020 election. You see, I had been, I'd kind of, I guess, passed the Trump sniff test, if you will. And so I was asked to come down to Washington, D.C. I met at Steve Bannon's office. This was right after the 2020 election. And I joined a team of 3 guys. One of those guys ended up becoming a business partner of mine, Harry Howry. And I hope to have him on the show coming up here and talk about some of the things that are going on in election integrity. But I have quite a bit of experience in that area. I've been an expert witness on multiple cases, including the one that went to the Supreme Court, and that was passed, and or sent back on grounds of standing. But I have, I've done a lot of work on the certification and accreditation of IT systems for the U.S. government. So that is truly an area of expertise that I have. And so I do expect to talk about a lot of those types of topics. I've also done a lot of work specifically as it relates to national critical infrastructure and the cybersecurity thereof. I worked for a cyber protection team that was part of MARFORCE Cyber, which is Marine Forces Cyber Command. And we went after hackers that were hacking our national infrastructure. And so I was detached to a national mission team and was basically a detached member to NSA. And that was really kind of my first foray into the intelligence community. And so there's going to be a lot of interesting topics, I think, that we'll get into. I'll try to do my best to not get too much into the technical weeds. And so, I am watching the comments and stuff. So if you guys, if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I'll stop occasionally and answer some of those questions. The other thing that has become, I guess you could say I've become an expert in, is in campaigning. For the last year and a half, I've been going through this experience of campaigning for Congress, and I campaigned hard. I will tell you, I put my whole heart into it. We put almost 100,000 miles on our vehicle. We covered 27 different counties. We had a very vast grassroots effort, and we started off with no experience, with no money, with no knowledge or understanding really how to do any of this, but really just the grit and desire, to be obedient to God. I ran because I felt the Lord calling me to run. I felt the Lord tell me to run. He didn't say I was going to win, but I can look back now, and hindsight's 2020. And a lot of times, when the Lord asks us to do something, we don't necessarily understand what it is or why it is that we're doing what we're doing, but we find out afterwards. And one thing that's become clear to me is that I had a very comfortable life. After I blew the whistle, I had a lot of trouble and a lot of stress in my life, and we fled. Maryland, left there. I got poisoned a couple of times, and had some attempts on my life. And I wanted to go somewhere where I could defend myself and protect myself. And so we uprooted, and we moved our family here to West Virginia. And I have not looked back, and it has been a wonderful experience living here. And so it is now what we're doing, though, as we moved in, we basically started just kind of getting our lives back together. And eventually what ended up happening was, this moment, I guess you could say, of where I felt the call of the Lord to jump into an election, something I really didn't want to do. And at first I was very much a reluctant candidate. But what ended up happening was, before long, I found that I fell in love with the people of West Virginia. I fell in love with, my neighbors, my fellow West Virginians, and, the American people. Because what I discovered was that everybody, I think, is busy trying to live their lives and trying to just, eke out a living and have some semblance of peace, and and trying to get ahead. And not a lot of people have the time or the energy, to jump into politics. And I get that. For the last, year, before I got into politics, I had the best summer of my life. I lived near the Potomac River. We'd get on my boat pretty much every day after work and, go out on the boat and just enjoy the beautiful Potomac River. And it was easy to forget about all the problems in the world. In fact, I spent 3 years living in Japan, and they were 3 of the best years of my life because there was not a single political ad on television that I had to watch. And life was great because I didn't have to stress out about those things. I just kind of, it's like that saying, ignorance is bliss. But I've come to realize something after going through what I've gone through over the last year and a half of campaigning. And that is that if we don't step up and start taking action for our own communities, and that's really where it starts. It starts in our own communities. It starts right in your own neighborhood, maybe even your own home. We got to start taking, back the ground that we've lost. And if we don't begin to do that, if we don't teach others to do that, our nation will fall. And so that's what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be about bringing awareness to those things, discussing the things that we can do, talking about, not just my experiences, but bringing on other people who hopefully have had some wins and have had some successes, and to talk about what we can do. I don't want this just to be an hour of griping, every Thursday, but I want it to be something that actually has meaningful impact. I'll give you an example, something I learned from campaigning. I had an opportunity while I was campaigning. Of course, most of my platform was focused on kind of 3 major things. And that was protecting, our national security and strengthening our national security, protecting our rights, our civil rights, and, against an overgrowing authoritarian government. And then the last one was helping to create, a flourishing economy in our country. Those were kind of my 3 major pillars. But what happened was, as I started going around and talking to people, people would bring up other issues, things that I hadn't thought about, things that weren't really on the front of my purview, but they had an impact. Some of those things were parents' rights. Parents' rights was one of the biggest ones that came up everywhere I went. I had parents that were asking me, they were talking about the schools. They were talking about how their kids were being indoctrinated. They were talking about how they had sexually explicit books in the school libraries, how they were allowing, kids to transition at school and not even notifying the parents, pulling their kids out of class to, talk to them and counsel them about their confusion over their sexual identity, things like that, or over their gender identity, things that parents should have the right to say no to, and to have the right to say, no, I don't want some, biological boy dressing and undressing in the same locker room as my young daughter. These were the kinds of issues that kept coming up over and over again. And I was just kind of, astounded, because I'll be honest with you, you hear these things, but until you see it, it really doesn't impact you. And so I was at a meeting out in Parkersburg, West Virginia, which is on the western side of my district. And it's about 4 hours away, 4.5 hours away from me. But my wife and I, we went out there to a meeting, and somebody brought one of these books, and they had it there, and they showed where they had checked it out of the school library. And I will tell you, without getting into the details of this book, it was so profane that as the guy started reading it, I was embarrassed. Like, it was not the kind of thing that you would expect somebody to read out loud, or in a church, which is where we were at, or in front of ladies. I mean, this was basically, it was a book about sexual relationship between an adult male and a young minor. And it had cartoon pictures of homosexual acts and things like that. And it was disgusting. And that's when I realized that, it was kind of a shock and awe tactic, but it woke me up to the reality that there were things that were going on that I didn't even understand the gravity of. And I needed to wake up and start looking into these things and then seeing what I could do. And so the first thing that we did was I started reaching out to volunteers and people who were supporting my campaign and asking, hey, what can we do about this? And somebody said, well, I started on a Parents' Bill of Rights, and I'm happy to hand that over to you, and we can work on it together. And so that's what we did. We got a bunch of us volunteers together. We took what he drafted and what he started with, and I added several other items in there that kind of dealt with the transgender stuff and the books and some of the newer issues that were coming up. And then then we said, okay, now we have this bill. What now? Well, we took it to a constitutional attorney who was volunteering for my campaign. I had him look it over. He massaged the language to make sure that it would stand up in court. Then the next thing that we did was we found a state legislator who was willing to sponsor the bill, and they got it written. And so one of my other volunteers out in Parkersburg, he had a legislator that he was close with and had been talking with, and so he got him to sponsor the bill. Then he came back and said, the bill's got a problem because it says this language, and we think that will counteract a law that we had last year. And I said, all right, well, what can I do? Can I take that bill and can I work it up, and change it and modify it? So we did. I took it back to my lawyer. I said, hey, there's a problem with this bill because of this language. Can we fix that? He put in a few provisions in there and a couple of exceptions that basically squared everything away, and we took it back, and it went through committee and it passed through committee. And we also did some other things too. We spent some money out of our campaign. We ran a nationwide press release to expose this bill and to put some political pressure on the state legislature to get it done. And I had the help of a very good comms director that helped me with that and getting that out there. So in the end, we were unsuccessful, but we got very far. We got it to pass the House. It failed in the Senate, partially because of the makeup of our Senate, which is changing, and hopefully the next Senate will be a better one. But we also learned some lessons in it. And one of those lessons is that you got to work on these bills from both sides. You got to work both with members of the House and with members of the Senate, or in the case of the with both your delegates and your state senators. And the same holds true within Congress, within the U.S. Congress. So the fact is that ordinary citizens can get things done. That's essentially how politics works today. One of the things that I learned is that a lot of the bills that we see that get passed are not actually written by the members of Congress or the members of our state legislators. They're actually written by lobbyists and special interest groups. So if that's the way the game is played, then we got to learn to play within those rules. And what that means is for us ordinary citizens, for us citizen activists, we've got to get to the point where we're willing to step it up, get together with, a committee of people, write a bill, and then lobby that bill and get it passed. And we can get things done, and we can accomplish things if we work together. So that is an example of the kinds of things that hopefully I hope to be able to inspire amongst all of you. And I've also in the process of starting an organization, and that organization's purpose will be to do those things, to carry on that work. So this will, in a way, kind of be an outlet, for that, to talk about these issues that are going on in our country and what we can do to actually change it. So we saw, speaking of issues, and I just gave that as one example of something that we accomplished that I think was pretty significant in the campaign. But there's been a lot of stuff going on in the news. Of course, we've seen, constant lawfare against President Trump. And, this is going to be interesting because I think the Democrats, they can't deny that they're going to lose, and they cannot. There's no way I think that they're going to be able to get Joe Biden to step down and not run and to replace him. I think that he will stay into the end. He's a very arrogant man, and I think that's That's evident by just his behavior in office. And so his blatancy, in using the DOJ to go after his political opponents, it's not really something that any former, well, I take that back, any former, with the exception of Obama. Obama was really the first one to unleash, the intelligence community against a sitting president and an incoming, president. So, but Biden has just been blatant about it. He doesn't care. He doesn't care to hide it. He doesn't care to try to even pretend. He has no problem with people knowing that he is attacking, his political opponent. So that does put us in a dangerous place as a country, because it further divides us. And as the saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall. Now, there does come a point, though, in every relationship where at some point in time you have to say enough is enough. And I think we are very close to there, if not there already, as an American people. We've seen the Democrat Party attempt to destroy, the very fabric of our, of our nation, of our culture, of our ideals of liberty and freedom. We've seen more authoritarianism within this particular administration, I think, than any other time in American history, except for maybe there was as much during, the time of FDR, where you had a 3-term president and you had him, locking up American citizens simply because they were of Japanese origin. But even still, you have things going on right now in this country where you have the Justice Department completely violating the Constitution day in and day out with no repercussions. There was a story that had come out several months ago about misuses of Section 702 of FISA. And FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance, the FISC, actually, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which was created because of FISA, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. But that court are the only ones that have the authority to issue warrants that would allow for essentially spying on an American citizen, but only as it relates to a foreign intelligence surveillance. So like, let's say they're spying on some foreigner and it happens to be an American that's talking to that person. Well, that's what, Section 702 is supposed to allow for them to do, is to use warrantless searches to be able to identify personnel and that sort of thing. And then you have special, warrants and things of that nature. But what has come out of that, and by the way, my time working for NSA, I was read onto that program because my work involved, cybersecurity and protecting our country against foreign aggression. However, I never abused that system, and I was very afraid to, because I was told that if I ever misused that, they gave an example of somebody spying on their girlfriend because they thought they were cheating on them, that you could go to jail for 10 years. And yet there were over 275,000 illegal uses of Section 702 in 2023. And this was put out there by a federal judge. And yet there's been no prosecutions. There's been nobody that's gone to jail for deprivation of rights under color of law. So we are living in lawless times where there are no consequences for the very people who hold power over us. And that is a dangerous thing. So there's a lot that is up in this head of mine that I've been talking about and thinking about over the last year and a half as I've been campaigning. Things that I had hoped to be able to, bring a bill or two, to the table to address these types of things. There are groups that I've listened to that have very interesting ideas, groups like Tactical Civics, that have really championed this idea of a citizen's grand jury, or a constitutional grand jury, and putting that back into power, and then giving power back, at the county level to bring some of these public officials to justice. There's also ideas of how we can decentralize power out of DC by moving federal agencies out of Washington, DC, and moving them all over the country. It makes it harder, number one, for for lobbyists to do what they do. But also, there's another thing, and that's that ever since COVID, we've learned that we can work remotely. We don't need to have all of our members of Congress in Washington, D.C. In fact, we're far better off if they're in their districts so that we can influence them as the people. And I think there are things that can be done to make that possible. I think those would be good first steps. But all of these things, all of these ideas, I want to talk about these things over the next several episodes and get through them one by one, and then come up with an action plan for each of them on how we can go into our communities, how we can formulate a group of citizens to take on action to write these bills and to bring these things to our state legislators, to our federal regulators, and hopefully have the impact that will actually be able to turn things around. So that's on the legislative front. But on the another matter, I think that is just equally important is that we have a culture problem in our country. What I mean by that is there are values that have stood the test of time, values that we've believed in, things like the idea of the nuclear family, and it's being challenged right now, and it is being torn apart and shredded by these ideas of transgenderism and and the LGBTQ movement. And there's also it goes way beyond that. You have record numbers of people who are living together and not getting married. You have record numbers of people who are choosing not to have children. And all judgments aside, from what's right and wrong, and whether or not you're a Christian believer or not, there are plenty of good reasons why we should be continuing to have a good birth rate and promoting the idea of marriage and the idea of the sanctity of marriage and the idea of having the nuclear family. For one, it's a tradition that has stood the test of time for thousands of years. And, literally within one generation or two, we are deciding to throw it out and, and to move in directions that I think are very destructive. And if you look back in history and you look and you see what has happened to other cultures that have, basically thrown out their institutions and their traditions that have been a part of their culture, it's generally led to the fall of those nations, to the fall of those cultures. Rome is a perfect example of that. There are many scholars that believe that Rome fell because of its immorality, and that was what it was at the heart of it. And I think there's some truth to that. So, I think we have to recognize that we have a responsibility not only to engage in politics, and a lot of people think of that word politics as kind of a dirty word. I certainly did. I hate the idea of being called a politician. But the reality is, politics and politicking and being a politician is a better alternative to what we had before that, which was despots and despotism. And so, politicking gives us the opportunity to debate and to argue and to win people over, through rhetoric rather than through warfare. And anybody who has ever served in the military, as I have, who has ever seen combat, thank God I have not, but I know plenty who have, know that if we can diplomatically resolve the problems that we have and learn to live together in peace and respect one another and respect one another's liberties and freedom and, pursuit of happiness, then I think that is a much better alternative to warfare, because warfare always sets back a nation, always. And just imagine, how much more prosperous and successful we could have been, if we had not been having all of these wars that we've been involved with. So I think it's just as equally important that we also look to tackle some of these issues that are cultural and to talk about some of these things that, we're dealing with as a nation. So some of them will be policy related, but some will be, culture and religion. There's nothing that uh, to me, they're all intertwined. And if we try to just isolate them and say, well, I'm only going to talk politics, or I'm only going to talk, about legislation, or I'm going to avoid those issues of ethics and morals and religion, we're fooling ourselves, because we are impacted by those things, and we are impacted by culture. And so I think it's good and important to discuss those things. So we're about the halfway mark here. And so I want to just go ahead and open it up here for a little bit of time here, just to allow some folks to ask some questions. So I'm looking here, and RJH said yes, and most of the time the ones voting on the bills don't read them. So I'm just bringing up that comment there so people can see it. That is very true. And a lot of these political bills, they, like I said, it arrives on a congressman's desk or a state legislator's desk, with, hours to read it. And, and it'll be, as thick as a couple of dictionaries, and like they're supposed to get through that and be able to read that. And I think that is something that has to change. Part of it is, we got to look at what the federal government is doing in particular. So there's a trade-off. They may say, well, we're going to not make some of these rules. We're going to pass down rulemaking to some of the regulators, the bureaucrats. And unfortunately, that is how we end up with stupid things like, the ATF passing this recently. They passed these rules to say that you can't have these certain attachments on your guns, even though it's clearly unconstitutional for them to do so. But they do it, and it's not an act of Congress, so it is not a law. It's just a regulation that was passed down by this set of bureaucrats who are not elected to anything. So, if part of the problem is we have too many laws, and that's one of the things that we have to recognize. There's too much that's happening at the federal level that doesn't need to be happening there. And so I think Trump was on the right track, where he had an executive order, I think, that he had passed, or a rule or something, that he said that for every bill, new regulation, they needed to go and remove 8 old regulations. I think that's a good idea, and I think that's something that needs to be put back into place when Trump gets back in, and I do believe he will be back in. And so that's one of the things that I think would be a good thing to look at our state legislators as well. Do we do that right now in our states? And every state is different. Some states are really bad, like California, where the code is just completely bloated, and half of it doesn't even make sense. But even here in West Virginia, we have problems with it. And so I do think that it would be good for whoever our next governor is going to be. And I think that's likely going to be Morrissey. I think it would be a good idea for whoever is going to be our governor to put into action, some sort of bill like that they will not sign a new law, into place until they've gotten rid of some old ones, because I think we need to shed some of these older bills. And the Patriots' prayer says they hide things in bills, and it should be one law, one bill. So they're talking about basically your omnibus bills. This is a tactic that's used oftentimes when it relates to spending in particular. Appropriations, I do think that there should be the ability for the members of Congress to go through a bill and see everything broken out and how it's being spent. And they should have that ability to, vote. And they may have to set up some rules for this, but they should have the ability to if a majority says, hey, we like this bill, except for this one provision, we want to strike, this one line item. I think that would be a good thing to have in there, because things do things do slip through that way. And it's a really, it's unfortunate when it happens, because It's that law of unintended consequences. So yeah, we definitely need to stop that sort of thing. So I'm curious, one of the things that has been a concern of mine, and this may seem radical to some people. For my fellow West Virginians, you probably won't see this as radical, but for some outside of West Virginia, they might. West Virginia has a very strong gun culture here, and I am 100% all for citizens owning guns, and I think the more the merrier. In fact, um, all the evidence seems to show that the more guns there are, the less crime there is. And so, when the guns are all in the hands of the criminals, that's it leads to to bad things. And so, but I can't ignore the fact that that we have a gun culture. We have a right, to carry. And I agree with Harry. Harry Legg says he believes in constitutional carry, and I agree. It's in our Constitution, and I think that every state should respect our right to carry, and I think that would be a good thing, especially because, like in my state, I can't get to certain parts of my state without passing through other states. So, what am I supposed to stop on the side of the road, take my gun, and put it in its case and separate it, the ammo from the gun, simply because I'm crossing through Maryland for 15 minutes? I mean, it's ridiculous. So I do think that we've got to have constitutional carry, and I think that would be something that would be very important for us to urge people. But as part of that, I do understand the necessity for training. As somebody who was in the United States Army and went through plenty of training myself, that is, I'm grateful for that training, and I think that because it is a right in our country to own a gun, I think it behooves us to ensure that our public schools that we have gun safety training and handling for youth. I think it should be in every school. It can be on a range. It can be, there's portions of it where they can have in the classroom, no bullets involved, obviously, but where they have a gun, they learn how to disassemble it, clean it, care for it. They learn about all the parts of it. They learn proper, carry and storage and handling. They learn the importance of it. I remember when I was, I think I was 18 years old, was the first time I ever went through hunter's training safety. I had never touched a gun. And I moved up to a rural area of Northern California, and I had to go through hunter's training safety course in order to get my hunting license. And the demonstration that they gave, where they had a watermelon up on a spike and they shot it with a shotgun, was probably the most effective thing that I saw, that really shows you the impact of a gun. Shows you that, there's no, you shoot somebody, there's no respawning. I think that would be a healthy thing for us to normalize that, and make sure that kids are learning proper safety and handling of weapons. Obviously, you may have some incidences where you have children that have mental health issues, and that has to be screened out, obviously. But I think that would be a good thing, and so I would encourage local school boards to consider that. But we have to get conservatives, on school boards, and on the boards of education, and to be able to change these things in our states. So that's something that I would encourage, because I think we've got to get back to, because it's a right, and nobody's ever going to take that right away from us. In fact, the Supreme Court has moved the exact opposite direction. They've become more and more pro-gun, and I venture to say that that's largely due to the fact that you had, hundreds of Antifa people and BLM people showing up outside our judges' homes, and in one case, in the case of Kavanaugh, I think the guy showed up with a gun, wanting to assassinate Kavanaugh. So, good job to the far left liberals for showing our Supreme Court, why it's so important that we should all be able to own and carry guns. because crazies might actually show up at your house, and you may not have 45 minutes to wait for the police to get there. So, but on that note, I'm a big advocate for training, and I think that training should be provided for by the taxpayer because it's a right. Because we have a right to guns, I think it makes sense that we ensure that there's good, solid training going into that. On the issue of election integrity and election security, one of the things that I'm hoping to see is I want to see. I'm working with a group here in West Virginia called West Virginia Citizens for Election Integrity. And we're going to be meeting with members of our state legislature and talking about the insecurities in our elections. And there are some. But the biggest one is really the lack of transparency. Because part of having a election system, part of what we're supposed to have is we're supposed to have a level of trust and certainty in our elections, and that has been broken since the 2020 election. In fact, I've said that the single most important reason that Trump must win this election is because until he serves out the second term that he actually won, there will never be trust in our elections ever again. And I really do believe that. So if we want to restore trust, then Trump needs to serve out the term that he was elected for. And so, and that's just, if no other reason, but I've got plenty of other reasons why I want to see him as president. Number one, I think he will work to, further America First policies, which is what we need. Because we are in a war, whether we want to admit it or not. We are in a trade war with countries like China. And but this election integrity group, one of the things that we are calling for and that we would like to see is, while we see that there is a need for the DREs, which are your basically direct input machines, where you're punching in your information and then it prints out a ballot and you can actually look at it and verify it. That's what we use here. I think it's the DS200s from ES&S. But beyond that, why those ballots should ever be placed into a tabulator, an electronic tabulator, where you don't get to see that your vote is actually being counted. That's where I have the problem. And I think that there's no need for the tabulators. I think we could get away from those, go back to hand counting the ballots at the precincts. I think the DREs is not a bad idea because of the fact that, we had the hanging chads incident, which is what led to electronic voting machines in the beginning. But I think it's gone too far. And that's one of the things that I think we could do is to eliminate the tabulators and go back to hand counting. And it would make, it would just add a level of assurance that things aren't being manipulated in an electronic way. And that's important. It still doesn't change the fact that you could have insiders manipulating elections through ballot stuffing. It still doesn't solve the problems with the voter registration, where you have people that are not legitimate voters being added to the voter registration so that they can use those names to create fake ballots. But in the 2020 election, I saw plenty of evidence that there was counterfeit ballots that were going on and that were being added in through the drop boxes. Anywhere where drop boxes are, we got to push to end those, because that's got to stop. There needs to be, total control and perimeter control over any ballot that enters into the election system. It should be reviewed with a photo ID, and should be reviewed by two judges, a Republican and a Democrat at least, to be able to verify each and every voter. This isn't hard to do. The state's already doing it. West Virginia does it with the ID. Now there are some things that I think that we could do better, and that's one of the reasons I'm meeting up with this group to work on those things. So that's another issue that I think is worthy of citizen action, and we can actually take action ourselves to do something about it. But we have to make those relationships. We have to take up sacrifice time. It means I might not be able to go to the river as many times as I'd like to. But it's important. It's important, folks. We've got to do it. And there absolutely must be a paper trail for everything. We cannot rely on digital records, period. The other thing that is kind of surprising, let's see here. I got a question here, question. Why isn't all national infrastructure on a SIPRnet? Okay, so SIPRnet is basically it's a within the Department of Defense, they have a secret network, and it is a closed system. Anytime you have one site going to another, they have encryptors, bulk encryptors that encrypt before they leave the site. It's very anything that's important and that is secret, that has any kind of national security implications, that could cause damage if it were information were to get out. It all resides on the SIPRnet, and the SIPRnet is then further locked down by having all kinds of firewalls and internal controls. So it's that notion of you got to have a need to know. Even if you have a secret, it doesn't mean you have access. You still have to have a need to know. So you got to get permission to access certain databases and things like that, access certain intelligence reports. So part of the problem, and to answer your question, the reason why all national infrastructure is not on SIPRnet is because a lot of our national infrastructure, for one, is actually owned and operated by private companies. It's just been designated as national critical infrastructure because it could be utilities, for example. It could be something like our election systems. And there have been moves recently, actually, in fact, there's a recent executive order that the Biden administration's cabinet members were just subpoenaed today. This actually broke the news about 7:40 today. There's a subpoena that's gone out to all of Biden's his cabinet members to basically say there was an executive order that says that the federal government will step in and ensure that everybody is given their right to vote, and that it's a ploy by the Biden administration to interfere with state elections. And the fact is that the Constitution is very clear that the federal government does not have any say in how elections are held, by the states. That is a enumerated power to state government. And the problem is that they've found ways of kind of sneaking in power. One of those ways was through the Help America Vote Act, which was a law that was passed by Congress right after the Hanging Chad's contested election between Bush v. Gore. And so in that case, the federal government said, look, we don't want to see this kind of stuff happening again. So we will provide you grant money to pay for electronic voting machines so that you don't have any more hanging chads. And we will, give you a grant of money from the federal government. But if you take that money, then you have to follow our rules. And they came up with some rules which actually aren't bad if they're enforced. These are rules that were set forth in the voting system standards by the FEC that said these machines that you use have to meet certain requirements. And then so that was kind of the first rule that came, and it gave the federal government power into federal elections. There's been a few other places too. They did this with the 1968 Civil Rights Act, where they created a law that said because of civil rights and because of disenfranchising Black voters, the federal government created a law that said you have to maintain all records pertinent to voting in an election for up to 22 months. And that's a federal law, so that an audit can be conducted at a later time if necessary. Not a bad law. I'm all for anything that increases transparency. And that law stood. So you also had the Voting Rights Act, and there's a few others. But HAVA really broke the mold, because what it did was it said, you will follow our certification processes, and you will follow these standards, these voting system standards for any machines that you use. And unfortunately, this is kind of one of those things of beware of the unintended consequences of some of these laws, right? The law of unintended consequences. What what that did was, by all these states jumping on board with that and buying electronic voting machines and all of that, next thing you know, the federal government now has a say, in how these machines are used and even what kinds of machines you can use. And so you have very few systems that are actually certified at the 3 national labs, and none of those national labs are even accredited. So it's kind of crazy, um, but yeah, it's a way that the government has kind of jumped in there and kind of taken over and overused their power. Harry says here, I agree with 1-day paper ballots. What if the power grid gets taken down on election day? Not good. That's true. But speaking of power grid, that's an important issue as well. And so this is to kind of round it back to the question earlier about why isn't it not all on a SIPRNet? The SIPRNet is specifically a network that is separated for military use only. There are other classified networks, like the FBI has its own called FBI Net. The Department of Justice has its own network. The DEA's got its own network. Several of the intelligence organizations, they have kind of a joint one that they use, and then there's some that they have that are their own internal networks that are classified. But I think really probably maybe a better question is, why are they not on closed systems? And part of the reason is because we use a lot of what they call COTS products, which are commercial off-the-shelf products. And so for a power grid, there might be components as part of the power grid that are created by a private corporation. And maybe there's a service agreement with a few different companies, and they have access to be able to remote in and manage those pieces of equipment and do updates and patches and things like that. Part of the problem our national critical infrastructure is in such bad shape is that it was created at a time that we didn't have hackers. There was no such thing as as the internet as we know it today. And so pretty much everything that was national critical infrastructure was part of what they called SCADA, or industrial control systems, and it was not connected to the internet. But because of the rising costs of labor and the convenience of the internet, it became thought, hey, we can just put some security on here and then allow for somebody to remote in, and they can run patches and manage things and monitor things, and monitor the controllers that are cleaning our water, for example, like a water treatment plant. We can monitor the chemicals that are going in with different sensors and things like that. So there's all these like conveniences and these great tools that have come about because of the internet, and allowed for us to do a much better job of maintaining and monitoring things so that we don't have an accident. But now we've made it easier for people to do intentional things by creating what we call in cybersecurity a vector, a point of attack. So partly what we have to do is we have to change the culture. Remember, I mentioned about culture. It's not just about regulation, but it's also about changing the culture. We don't have a culture in the industrialized world of looking at security. It's just not there. It's always an afterthought, and that's why things get hacked. 9 times out of 10, the reason that things get hacked is not because you had some great hacker who found some great loophole to be able to get into a system. It's usually because somebody failed to patch their system, or because of human error, because somebody basically was foolish and decided to not pay attention or not do their daily checks and things like that. So some of these things we have advances that are coming forward with AI that is going to help. Those systems that are monitoring for anomalies are going to get better and better at detecting potential infiltration because of AI. But AI in and of itself has its own problems too, because again, it's software driven. So So we're moving in interesting ways, and I do think I am not a I'm not an enemy of AI, but I'm a cautious promoter of it. I think that AI has the potential, to give us an edge, and because our enemies are using it, like countries like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, even, um, we have to use it. We don't have a choice. We have to move forward, and we need to develop AI, and we need to do it responsibly and very carefully. So, all right, there's a comment here. Let's see. This is what China is doing to many third world countries so they can control them. They are building the infrastructure with proprietary parts and software to control them. Absolutely true. I'll give you an example. Kenya, uh, almost all their ports are taken over by China now. China has the contracts to run their ports. And believe it or not, the Port of LA, which is one of the largest ports on the western seaboard of the US, under the Obama administration, was under a Chinese contract. And I think Trump ended that. I don't know what the status of it is today, but I know Trump ended it. And the fact is that this is why this policy that Trump has of America first is so important. It doesn't just It's not just that we need to ensure that we are maintaining, sovereignty over our own infrastructure, but it also has to do with what they call supply chain risk. So, if you and I'll give you one example, and I got to be careful about how I give this example, but let's just say hypothetically, you have a government building that's outfitted with cameras, and there's a component in those cameras, and these are remotely controlled cameras, but there's a component in those cameras or in a fire suppression system or any other kind of safety piece of equipment that has a component that is made in China, and there's malware in that component that is either has what's called a time bomb in it, meaning it has a piece of malware that will activate on a certain date and time, or it has so it's not detectable until it decides to turn on, or it could be that it has basically it will beacon back to a location to where then it can give remote control access to be shut down or whatever. I mean, that's the kind of thing that every nation state wants, so that if they ever have to use it, in a time of war, they can shut down pretty much all the defenses of the country that they're going to invade right before they invade. So that is a real risk. That is something that we have to be careful of. We're constantly being probed, and we're seeing evidence of that. We're running up on the 10 o'clock, and so I want to thank you guys for joining. We're going to do this again, and I may we'll get better at it. This is my first time doing this style, and again, I want to bring on guests, and I may even move it to a little bit longer, maybe an hour and a half, to be able to get through some of these things. But I expect that we're going to have some very interesting conversations, and I will eventually get something set up here so that we can even do, people calling in and that sort of thing. But thank you guys so much for joining me right now. And there's a lot more that I'd love to say and talk about, but I want to keep it to 1 hour this first time, because that's like an impossibility usually for me. Yes, Ivan Rakelin's a good friend of mine. I'd love to bring him on, and I'll talk to him about that, because he's got a lot of things I think that we could talk about in what we could do. Ivan, he said about me, he said that he was one of the people who had endorsed me and endorsed my candidacy. He said that I was a surgical ice pick because I knew where all the bodies were buried, and he's right. I know, how they're violating the Constitution within the FBI, and I'm sure that had a lot to do with why 700,000 was given to my opponent 7 days before the election through a dark money pool. Curious as to where that money came from, but nonetheless, the deep state's going to rue the day that they ensured that I didn't get elected, because I guarantee you, I'm probably going to be far more effective and more of a thorn in their side outside of government than I would have ever been able to get done inside of government. And that's not to say that I might not run again in the future, but it won't be in the near future. I realize I need to build an infrastructure to be able to, win a national election again. And so I'm going to be working on that. And if that happens, then great. MC POTA, yes, thanks, Harry, for bringing that up. I'm going to just mention to folks that don't know what that means. MC POTA was my code name when I was a whistleblower. And it was given to me by my lawyer, who was a Cuban immigrant who hated communism, saw his father in a Castro work camp. And he said, when I got my paperwork from the Inspector General Michael Horowitz, it said my client will heretofore be named or will be called MC POTA. And I asked my lawyer, I'm like, why MC POTA? You couldn't pick some cooler code name than that? And he says, oh, no, trust me, you'll like this. And I go, well, what does it even mean? He goes, it means making communists pay out the ass. So with that, thank you guys so much for joining, and God bless you. And just remember, the saying by Edmund Burke, all that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. So it's time for us to get off our butts and to do something. God bless you guys, and good night.